This is the fourth video for Python. I'm using W3 Schools. It's a free platform. Gives you some pretty good, or at least a pretty good overview of various programming languages. I'm just trying to go through Python. I've used Udemy before, for those of you who've followed along. This one's a pretty easy one to follow. So I decided that this would be a good course just to make some basic videos on. Also, I'm just trying to get a refresher. Like a lot of people, maybe you've learned Python, or sometimes it takes a little bit of time to pick up on things. So it's always good to go back and get kind of a quick refresher. And if you've seen it before, that's fine. The more times you see something, the more practice or experience you'll get with it. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. If you have, feel free to skip along. But I'm going to go over numbers today, different types of numbers within Python, and how you can figure out what kind of data you're working with. All right, so the main types going to have integers, float, complex, and then for the most part, integers are just going to be your positive and negative numbers. Float is going to be decimal points, and then complex, it's a number that adds a j to it. It's largely used in engineering and more complex math. I'm not going to go into it heavily right now, simply because it is a little more advanced, but I'm just going to go over it so you kind of know what variables are out there. All right, so for the most part, going to have a couple different ones here. Now, this one already gives you the hashtag. I've went over that. This is if you have a hashtag, it's something that's not going to necessarily get printed if you're doing a program in Python. So if I want to take this over to the editor, I can list this, and then I can just come down here and write print x. Should print 1 when I do this. Assuming I did it right. There we go. All right, 1. So integer, and then a float, decimal, and then complex. This is sort of a placeholder if you're doing various types of engineering math. Again, I'm not going to get too much into it into this particular video. Integers, so again, long numbers, short numbers. Float, decimals for the most part, can be positive or negative. The interesting thing is within Python, if you have a lot of numbers going out pretty far distances, and long as they're a power of 100, you don't have to write out all the zeros. You actually can use E within as part of the scientific notation. So for instance, down here in Z, all right, so you can utilize E to help indicate certain powers of 10. So that's really good. And then again, complex numbers are written with a J as the imaginary part. Again, it's a little more complicated than that, and it's largely used for things that I probably haven't even delved in myself. So as we learn a little bit more about Python together and go into this, I'll certainly show you a couple of certainly basic examples where you can utilize this. But you have to stay tuned because we got a few things to go over. As you can see, we're pretty early in the process here. All right, and then the other thing I like about W3 is it gives you some basic examples. So if you want to see what all of these are, for instance, if you type a variable and you want to know it's an integer, you can do various types of formats, and if you put the word type in front of it, like type, and then it's going to say variable A. The reason it's A here is because we're initially saying integer x is a 1. That's a plus or minus. That's an integer, but you can convert it to a float. So it could say 1.0, and then type, and then it will come back and say that that is, oops, a float integer. So let me grab that. So yep, so 1.0. All right, and then it tells you the class float. Type A is now float since we converted it. So it was an integer. We said variable x, which is float, and then x within the parentheses is now a float variable. And as I mentioned, those have decimals. So that's why it comes back with 1.0. And then, interestingly, why it converted to an integer, that was 2.8. and it just made it a 2. Interestingly, it doesn't really round up to 3. There are some programs you can use or some coding you can use to do that, but for the initial one, it just keeps it as the first number in that sequence before the decimal. And then the type, now it tells you our first variable is now a float instead of an integer. Our second one is an integer instead of a float, and then complex we left alone. So, all right, feel free to practice this and start becoming a little familiar with the information. It's good to know as we progress. And again, the really good thing about Python gives you a short little quiz, so we know long was certainly not something that we went over, so there aren't any variables identified as long. Insert the correct syntax to convert x into a floating point number. All right, so this is where you can get a little bit of practice with that. So x will equal, and then you'll put, floating number. Whoops, cursor's not working there. Float x. Okay. Normally I like to rename it to a different variable, not just x. I might call it a, and then that equals something else. But for integer, we'll just put int. This is why you want to do the little test. It just gives you just enough practice so it starts to become muscle memory. Because the main thing, coding's not hard, but you have to realize what you can do. And if you don't know where to start, or you're not memorizing some of the syntax, then when you get down here to some of the harder stuff, it becomes a little more complicated. All right, so I went ahead and did a quick little practice test, and that concludes it for this video.